right? When you've studied the Holocaust, when you've studied the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the name of equity and Marxism, and you've seen the depravities to which human beings can go when they lose touch with the value of the individual person, when they put the person's group above their individual identity. He spent his life studying this, and he's seen the horrors of it. Like, part of it is self-righteousness, and part of it is just, look, this is horrible. This is, no, you've got to look at the sheer evil of this. So existence exists like it's happening. That's right. We interproject it into existence, objects of mind, like things which exist for us, around which we build stories. Right? Like, architect look around the room, interior decorator look around the room. The things which exist for the existence, TS, that we experience are a function of the frame that we take to look at it. Right? So there's this, like, existence, interpretation, maps, narrative frames. Right? And then existence, the things that we experience as things that we, like, play with. Right? Now, those existence live in kind of metaphoric contexts. Like, we tell a story about those things, and those stories aren't necessarily connected. Right? There's like lots of stories going on which are loosely connected in hierarchies and holarchies of different kinds of meanings. Right? So there's all these stories going on in our head, right? And if we look at the same existent, we can see it through multiple dimensions. Like, what is this? Well, this is a whole bunch of sensory data, right? That actually range from kind of like orange to white in wavelength. And it's got a certain shape and stuff, but we can still tell the story of pen. We can tell the story of doorstop. We can tell the story of cylinder, like. So we've got these existence that live in these different metaphorical contexts. Okay. Like one context is politics. Like there's one context is politics. Right? So we can look at things from a political lens, and we can look at things in terms of, well, how are we using force around this issue? Kind of take a libertarian angle. Say, when we look at this issue, when do we use force and when do we use persuasion? Right? Just an angle that we can take to look at this set of existence that we interproject into existence. And when we use that lens of force, we interpret different existence and we tell different stories about them. Then we can look at the story of personal development. Like, how do we use this to thrive? Right? Or we can look through the realm of, well, prejudice and oppression and structures of oppression. Right? So, like, these three have confluence. They all come together in the wage gap. Right? There's the wage gap between men and women. We can look at it from a market perspective and say, well, I mean, people are choosing. Are people being forced to work at certain wages, or are they choosing to work for certain wages? Right? Or we can say, no, it's structural oppression. Or we can say, okay, so what kind of money do you want to make? And how are you going to go about making more money? And right? It's like these three different angles on this thing. Now, each story has its own life, its own plot, its own set of narrative structures, its own set of possibilities that we can play a game with. And each one of them deals with different stuff. If we look at one through the lens of the other, or if we look at them in combination, we can look at all three of those together. We can look at, okay, so how does the structural oppression fit into the free market ideas? How do those two ideas fit? Where are they different? Where are they the same? And in the process, we'll not only create a third story, a meta story that can contain both of those stories. Right? Our story of freedom and force versus persuasion will actually start to incorporate the elements of structural oppression. It will expand the story. It will make it richer and deeper. It will add more dimensions to the story. And if we look at, but at the same time, it's also going to change our understanding of structural oppression, because we're going to start looking at the differences of structural oppression that come from force versus persuasion. So when we combine the two stories, we not only create a meta story, we also enrich both stories. And how they get enriched is uncertain. And what that's going to lead to is uncertain. Okay, great. So we're going to talk about Game of Thriving and Korzybski. Right? Who knows where it's going to go? We're going to go places like when I bring my version and you bring your version, and they come together, it's going to open up shit we don't understand. So go with the part that's the most unknown, the part that you just thought of yesterday that you haven't worked out. That sounds awesome. How is that for a 15-minute Mark doing his thing?
I love it. I miss you.
Okay, your turn.
So a couple of things, when you were speaking, a couple of things popped up in my head. One was, so you're talking about the integration, the combination of different frames of reference, of different viewpoints, creating a larger viewpoint, so to speak, a more comprehensive view at reality, at like that chunk of, whatever the fuck's happening out there, right? What is going on? And one way to do that is by taking different points of view, different ways of looking at it, and then integrating them. And I would say what Korzybski would add to that is it's not just taking those frames of references, but it's within those frames of references, how are you evaluating, right? How are you taking in information? How are you abstracting, getting those larger patterns involved? And that there's some ways to do that that are actually scientific and proper evaluation, right? There's ways to do that that are better than other ways to do that. One way would be like to start with the facts or with an hypothesis, with the question, and look at what you're looking at, and then start getting data, and then from the data making evaluations in terms of, like, let's say racial oppression. How much is racial oppression affecting, not racial oppression, but we'll say like the patriarchy, right? Is there such thing called the patriarchy, and how much is that affecting the wage gap right now, right? Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't start off, if you're a scientist, you wouldn't start off with the fact that there may be something called a patriarchy would be more of an hypothesis, right? Mm-hmm. Right? But you wouldn't start off, if you start off with that as your conclusion and then look for evidence just to support that conclusion, then your evaluations are going to be off.
Right. And in modern terms, it's going to be just an expression of confirmation bias, where you just look for the evidence that fits your position rather than using the question to look for evidence, which you then look for patterns in the evidence, or to test. Or was he into? Did he deal with Karl Popper the idea of science as the denial, as the negation, that you create a hypothesis and then you attempt to prove it wrong, And to the degree that you fail at proving it wrong, your hypothesis stands stronger.
I haven't heard him. I haven't heard of the name Karl Popper, so I don't know. But it sounds very similar in that he does speak of negation, right? He speaks of, I guess, one of the major thing that he speaks of is different levels of abstraction and analyzing at different levels of abstraction. And he believes that one of his major points is that linguistically we have structural limitations in our linguistic system. We have primitive metaphysics, so to speak, that become implicit within the structure of our system that has us equate or identify different orders of abstraction with one another, right? So in moving up the chain, you start with the objective, unspeakable levels of reality, completely nonverbal levels, things that you can't, whatever you say of it is not going to be the thing, right? You can basically only point to it, right? Because whatever word you put on it isn't it. It's like, whatever you say about the Tao, is not the actual Tao, right? And as we move through different orders of that level of nonverbal reality, chunks of reality, we start with like the event, the object, and then a recognition, an image of that comes inside your mind. So now you have the thing out there, and now you have the image of that in your mind, both of which are nonverbal, right? And then only from there do you get from there comes higher levels of abstractions, including the verbal level of abstraction. And as you move up from chain to chain, one thing that he pointed out that that happens is that characteristics are left out. Things are left out as you move up towards the higher levels of abstraction. So when you get to the verbal levels of abstractions, you've already left out a lot of information. And the nature of the abstraction is also different. It's more of a static creature than it is a dynamic creature, right? So the underpinning of ideologies and dogmatism and fundamentalism is all based on confusions. You would say a confusion of an order of abstraction, of thinking that the verbal level is the objective reality level when it's not. It's not truth, right? It's only
in the classic term, the map is not the territory.
That is one of his main points.
Right.
That the map is not the territory, and we mistake the map with the territory in our nervous systems. That's really a thing.
Yeah. If I heard you say, you said something earlier, I want to make sure I understood it right. So you've got these nonverbal levels of experience, like the objectively unspeakable thing. What did you call it?
Objectively unspeakable levels, yes.
There's the objectively unspeakable levels, what I might be calling, in the map I put out at the beginning, what I might be calling existence. That's right. And existence comes in and actually affects our neurology. Like the existence, we actually experience existence through our neurology. That's the first level of abstraction and filter. Right? Like I only feel what I can feel. I can only see this wavelengths that I can see. I can only hear the sound things that I can hear. And my neurology takes this data and creates a neurological representation of it, which is completely nonverbal. And then that gets integrated in my brain in some type of experience, which is a higher level abstraction, which is also nonverbal. And then I start to make sense of that, and then I weave narratives around that. Each of these logical levels, if I equate this as this, like if I think that this story that I'm telling, which is built of these elements or images, which are built on the neurological abstractions, which are built on the experience, if I think that this is this, then I'm confusing my logical levels. Because at each level of this, there's in NLP, in the linguistic portion of NLP, they say deletion, distortion, generalization. Like at each level of this, and even once you get into the image level, which we then tell stories about and narratives about that. At each logical level, we delete, we distort, and we generalize.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That this level of abstraction deals with a different, like you said, you miss information or you lose information.
Yes, you lose characteristics, you lose information. Yes, as you go up, right? There's a different order to the different levels of abstraction, right? There's a different quality to the different levels as you move up the chain, and it's a cycle. And eventually, it comes back down. Higher levels are translated back down to lower levels when the nervous system cycle is working efficiently. Yes, but yes, it's like when the stone hits your foot, right? That is translated into the nervous system in a multitude of different ways, but the quality of the nervous system, right, reaction is different than the actual stone that's making contact with your foot, right? It's more of if you could say that is like a representation of the stone hitting your foot, but it's like a completely different character than the actual stone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then once you've told the story about it, depending on the story, I'll say story. Once you have an order of abstraction, you have a representation of what happened. Once it exists, it takes on a life of its own. It has its own set of rules. It has its own set of understandings, which can be so decoupled from the actual thing that the orthogonal nature of it, the fact that they don't match, can lead to all kinds of ineffective behaviors. But what I heard you say is that it then recycles. And if I'm imagining, to the degree that the higher order abstractions are incongruent with or fundamentally missing some important data down in the lower levels of abstractions, that once I've had this thought, for example, my toe still hurts. So now I'm experiencing my toe hurting, but I'm experiencing it through this higher level abstraction story. And so I now systematically take this story and weave it back into the experience. And I get this kind of confirmation bias where it's like, oh, the stone meant to hurt me. And so now when I look in, I interpret that through this lens. And so I find the things that match my story, which verifies my story, which reifies it, which turns it into, I'm now certain that this is the case because I found data that matches my story and I haven't checked to see the mismatch between these.
That's right. Yes.
And general semantics in some way is designed to undo that. So that's a huge jump. So I'll shut up now and you can go wherever you want. But
general semantics is sort of a way to, I'd say, one level, to not equate whatever story you have with to say that is the truth, that is the thing that happened. That's an idea I have, that's an hypothesis, and I have this set of data, this set of data, and this set of data to support this conclusion that I've made, right? And so
to keep that whole story in mind, rather than to collapse it down into I have proof that this is how it is, and then I lose the I have proof and it's just this is how it is.
That's right. Yes, to keep the other levels of abstraction in mind as reference points to the higher levels of abstractions. So he calls it the consciousness of abstracting, right? Moving systematically up from the lower levels to the higher levels of verbal representation, and starting with the descriptive reality level of representation. So there's levels of verbal representation too. You want to start with descriptive level before you move on to inferential, evaluative, meaning-making levels. So there's like a reality. What's my description of reality? Kind of, I liken it to like the fair witness perspective from
Heinlein. From Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yes, it's a way of describing reality as a fair witness, as exactly, this is exactly objectively what I see. And then
Yes,
from there,
and the classic example of the fair witness is that Jubal asks, not Dorian, Jubal asks Anne. He says, what color is that house on the hill? And she says, it's white on this side.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. She doesn't presume to know the color of the rest of the house.
Correct. Because
only what she can see. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the descriptive level of language, or the descriptive level of verbal representation, is that what he would say, verbal representation?
Yes. Yeah.
So the descriptive level, right, in the 5, where you've got reality, reason, responsibility, respect, and realization, right? The descriptive level is designed to be really kind of just the facts, ma'am.
That's right.
Right. It's like, okay, what's the information about the territory? Like, what's the first level map? Not what does it mean? And then how does that fit into my values? And is it good or bad for me? Or is it good or bad for something that I care about? Right. But what is it? And not, therefore, what should we do in groups, in my life, and based on what I think is good for me, based on what the description is, based on what the territory is.
Yes. Yes, what are the facts, right? Mm-hmm. Starting with the facts, starting with reality, starting with your description of reality on an objective level before making an opinion about it, right? Starting with that before stating your opinion. Most importantly, like, not confusing your opinion, your inferences of reality with reality itself. That would be another confusion in order of abstraction, mm-hmm. Which he would call a delusion, right? Confusing your opinion with reality. You want your opinions of reality to be grounded in your description of reality.
Mm-hmm. And you want to recognize that your description of reality is just a description based on the data that you're doing. And the more you keep those multiple orders of abstraction, the more you're conscious of the orders of abstraction, conscious of the abstraction process.
Consciousness of the abstraction. Consciousness of abstraction.
Okay, yeah. Conscious. So the more you have consciousness of the abstraction, the more you keep in mind that your opinion is different than the description. That it's a higher order abstraction than the description, and the description is a higher order abstraction than the actual experience, which is a higher order abstraction than the actual reality.
That's right.
And if you keep those orders of abstraction in mind, you maintain consciousness of the abstraction, and that keeps you from equating the things and makes your representation more sane, and that's more scientific. Is that?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Consciousness of abstracting, you'd say, is a solution to the identification problem. You would say
the identification problem.
That's right, yes. That is the main scourge, he points out, in our language system, is identification of these different levels, confusions of the orders of abstractions, identifying one level with the other level, and yes.
And so identification and identity. So we could say identity is to say that this is this. In the simplest language, right? This is this. This equals this. This is the totality of this. Like, if you know this, then you know this. If you're talking about this, then you're talking about this. This is identity. They have the same identity. And identification in this sense means, like, the problem of identification, as you're describing it, means it's like making things identical which are not truly identical, because each of these orders of abstraction has a different identity. Like, they're not identical. Each level is, you've got deletion, distortion, generalization. That's right. And you're missing information. And so if the problem of the scourge, I love that, the scourge of identification is that you make things identical which are not. Is that? It's different than identifying what something is. Like there's identification as a naming process, as a studying process in which you create an abstraction, but you recognize that it's an abstraction, but you're testing it to see does it speak to the essential thing such that I can identify it through language so that we know what we're talking about. But the scourge of identification is about making things identical which are not identical. Is that right?
That is correct. So there's a definition he gives of identification, of identity, which is, I guess in short term, an allness throughout time, right? This is identical. An allness throughout time, yes.
Ooh.
Allness, yeah. Yes, and so which he says is part of our primitive metaphysics. But knowing of what we know of science today, or when he wrote this book, Science of 1933, right, that is actually fundamentally impossible because we live in a world of absolute difference. When reality is, there's no two things that are exactly the same. So when we say this is that, right, or you are a jerk, right, or that those two things, when you're not conscious of what you're doing about that, can create a lot of dysfunction, right? It creates a delusional world picture, right? A delusional world view that's intellectually you can understand, but in the nervous system, because that's the process, that's the thing that actually creates our representations of reality is our nervous system. Having that in the nervous system can be very, very problematic, right? It's when people become certain about their points of view, when they become certain about their ideologies, that sort of thing. Because when they say this is the truth, right, they're saying that their idea, so they're confusing orders of abstraction, but they're also making a claim about the nature of reality in some way. They're making assumptions about their point of view and what reality is, and that identity is something that's actually possible, right? And so a way this can look like in the nervous system is like thinking that like an experience that I'm having is one that I'll have throughout all time, throughout all existence. Like I know shame can be one of those. Like I'm wrong, not just in this moment, in this place of time, right? But it's like through all time, through all history. This is going to be me right now, right?
Yes, and I'm getting that like the allness is it's through all time.
That is correct. Yes, okay. Through an infinite amount of years. Yeah.
And another dimension of allness. So you've got time. Another dimension of allness that I hear in what you're saying when you talk about shame is that it's not that I am wrong in this situation at this time. What is the I again? Oh, yeah. Like a part of me like did an action which was wrong in this situation and in this time. Like each of those separate dimensions. It's no, all of me is wrong. Right? And it's not just wrong in this action. It's wrong in all actions. And it's not just in this situation. It's in all situations across time, across all time. The allness. What's the phrase of identification? It's the allness.
Allness throughout time.
Allness throughout time. Yeah. So it's all, including time, and he specifies throughout time because that's because he has some, like time is really important to him. What you can do with time and how human beings are with time. I remember something about that.
Time is important. Time is really important to him. Yeah. It's one of those markers of a four-dimensional worldview, right? He says that it's kind of lost in like identification, in the allness of it. You lose space and time in some way.
So he lived in the time of Einstein.
He did, yeah.
So space time and abstraction time Like when you have an abstraction, you've got these orders of abstraction, and you're creating these different mental models, or you're creating these different maps. And there's like what's happening in your neurology, and then your image, and then the descriptive level of what's happening in the images, and then the inferential, evaluative orders, and all of the things that come from that. At each of those different levels, those all happen in how is that like time and space? Like if the Einstein relativity understanding is that you can't think about objects outside of time, or to the degree that you think about objects outside of time, you're missing something critical. That time and space are not different things, they're different dimensions of the same thing.
Yes.
How does time I'm not sure if I'm even hearing this right, but how is time bound to orders of abstraction like space is bound to time? Is that even a reasonable question in terms of Korzybski?
I think I can answer this in a couple of different ways. See if I want to get to the heart of what you're asking. How is time bound to the orders of abstraction? Is your question?
Yeah. How does? Sorry, I'm just another one of my tangents. I heard in what you were saying 4 dimensions of the world, which is space, 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. That time is somehow connected to abstraction in the way that time is connected to space. That's what I heard you say, and so that's where I was going for. While you could answer that and go for it, I'm also wanting you to go wherever you want to go.
Okay. I want to really understand this question. So let me try one way to just what pops up in my head. And I don't know if it's going to really answer this question, but maybe we can get more precise, like towards in that direction. So part of Korzybski's one of his main points is that there's a primitive metaphysics in our nature of abstraction, including identification, that eliminates, in some way separates space and time and matter, right? Creates a two-dimensional view, kind of a two-dimensional viewpoint of reality, kind of like we had like thousands of years ago when we didn't know about all this stuff, and we didn't know that space and time were actually intricately connected, and you can't really separate those two without losing some things, right? Basically, he's talking about elementalism in that way, in which we have an elementic presuppositions, and part of what that created was that we had the idea that there was our nerve impulses moved in infinite time, right? That there was like we had this conception of reality in which our nerve impulses would move like at an infinite rate of movement, because that's kind of what it could seem like if you didn't know that light nerve impulses traveled at a certain rate. And when that happened, like we kind of lost the order in it, right? If everything happened infinitely and there was no stepwise order of abstractions, right? So introducing the elements of like space and time and matter, and that they're all like connected in one way, that's actually a more updated viewpoint of reality. Like in our metaphysics of science have shown us that a 4-dimensional viewpoint of space-time is actually a more accurate depiction of reality than whatever we had before, when we thought that our nerve impulses and light moved at an infinite rate of speed, right? So knowing that, we now have a better view of what science tells us of what reality is, and that is included. We want to include that in our conceptions of reality. Like and he has a way to do that too. And this is part where I don't completely understand how he does it, but when we abstract when you abstract like a pencil, for example, or like a cell phone, like part of the initial abstraction about that is what science knows about this object right here, right? And so, like, underneath it, we know that there's like electrons and photons and quarks and whatever all that stuff is happening, but he wants to include that in our abstraction process, knowing that like there are things that we don't see that exist in that process. So that I would say that includes notions of space and time and how they're connected, right? Rather than yeah, I think so. That's my
and so you could say at each of those levels, we're dealing at a different level of abstractions: quarks and atoms, and quarks and electrons, and atoms and molecules, and electronics and energy. Like each of those is a different level of abstraction. The more we can have consciousness of the abstraction, the more of those levels that we can keep in mind when we're thinking of the thing, the
That's
more
right.
adequate our map is, such that when we interact with the territory as our neurological map of the territory, the more of those levels of abstraction we remain conscious of, the more
Mhm.
adequate our map is in terms of guiding us through the territory. Okay, now I would say that that's about making us more powerful at being able to use reality to build things. That the more, you could say, the more fidelity between our map and the territory in the dimensions that we're working, the more our plans are going to work. Right? And the more our plans work, the more complex things that we can build, to the point that like our maps of energy and light and recording allow us to be speaking essentially real time with visual information, even though we're in different cities and different states of the union. Right. So when our maps deal with enough, when our maps have enough consciousness of abstraction that they keep the different levels in mind, that gives us power to create things of increasing complexity and therefore increasing beauty.
That is correct. Yes.
Right. So I would say that. And what makes that possible is that we can create abstractions in language that last over time. And the more complex our language, the more it keeps the consciousness of abstraction, the more that language can last through time in a way that creates power and beauty. Right? This is I'm always, I'm always looking for, okay, so how does this translate into, how does this make me more powerful in creating beauty? And it seems to me that this understanding of the multiple orders of abstraction and keeping them in mind, remaining conscious of the consciousness of the abstraction, allows you to keep, okay, yeah, this cell phone has multiple levels and it's not instantaneous. Like all of those levels don't all happen at the same time, and therefore they come down to an identity. There's actually there's a sequence of deletions, distortions, and generalizations where each of these orders of abstraction are in a tenuous, flexible, rediscoverable relationship with one another. And the more you keep that in mind, the more it becomes a dynamic knowing, a dynamic understanding rather than a static knowledge.
That's correct. Yes. Then that's his precise reason for wanting to include dates, right? When in making a knowledge claim. Like this is of science of 1933. This is what we know, right? Or this is what I know right now based on the science of what I have like right now. Knowing that science of 2018 is going to be different than science of 2030, right? Those are just going to be different things because science is something that keeps growing. In a way, it
Yes.
allows for the evolution of knowledge and an updating of the maps, right?
Because
Not saying
because because the maps exist through time with human beings, and they grow through time, and through science we can refine our maps. We can create hypotheses and then test them. And therefore we can refine our maps and maintain more and more consciousness of the abstractions involved in our maps, so that when we use the map to confront reality, when we get data from reality, or when we use our maps to interact with reality, when we build plans, hypotheses, and then test those hypotheses, enact the plans, right? We get new data. And the more conscious we are of the orders of abstraction, the more we can fit the data that we get into the appropriate level of the orders of abstraction, refine our map, which we can then carry through time and build. And this is the scientific enterprise, for lack of a better term. So I don't know how much of this is Korzybski, but
This fits, yeah. This totally fits with Korzybski. And
Gypsy.
what he would say, what he would say would be that the only content of knowledge is structural in a way. Like our maps are accurate to the degree that the structure of our map replicates or is like isomorphic, so to speak, with the structure of reality.
Does he use isomorphic?
He may use isomorphic. I kind of
you may have read that in. No.
I may have read that in.
Isomorphic is the best term, right? So I'll say something. So in postmodern analysis, like one of the ideas of postmodern analysis is that it deconstructs the idea of a correspondence idea of truth. Correspondence idea of truth says that I have an idea and it's identical. It corresponds to the underlying territory, right? And that if that's your idea of truth, you have a very limited idea of truth, because there are so many dimensions, like there's so many different ways of abstracting reality, that it's not that it corresponds, it's that it's isomorphic. That the abstraction that you're using, the dimension that you're looking at it through, the language that you're creating, whether it's descriptive or evaluative or political or aesthetic, right? These different dimensions of each one of them has its own qualities. Like, is this orange, or is it a cylinder, or is it plastic? Right? Which one is the true correspondence? Well, no, that's a silly question. There are different dimensions, different levels of analysis, different ways of abstracting the object. Right? And so it's not about correspondence, it's about congruence. It's about, does the form that I'm creating match the form of reality in a way that the metaphor works, that the abstraction holds true across test, across hypothesis. And we can refine the nature of the metaphor, this isomorph, like there's the form in this metaphor and the form in reality. Like we say atoms. Are atoms really nuclei with electrons spinning around them? That's a metaphor. It works to the point where we can start to basically split the atom and create, right, atomic energy, which is pretty damn impressive. The electron is not in spinning around, it's in a cloud of probability that collapses to a point upon measurement, right? It's like that's a different metaphor that gets done. So isomorph is a much better description than correspondence. Isomorph, congruence between the metaphors, and expanding your metaphors, like coming at the wage gap from a libertarian perspective, where the question is, okay, so are you using force or is this voluntary? Coming at it from a structural oppression perspective, right, which is, are people being treated based on their merit, or are they being treated based on prejudice and historical structures that don't allow them to be seen for their merit, that their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their age, their size, their attractiveness, like all of these things become structures of mind, like structures of abstraction that occlude and make it impossible to see the actual merit, because it must be translated through these structures of gender. Like, that's a perspective. And when you take these two perspectives together, you can find where they're isomorphic, where they're congruent, and create the higher level thing and expand your metaphors. Okay, thank you for that tangent. So you're saying that there's an isomorph between the levels of representation and the levels of representation.
That's right. Yes. Yes. They're the degree to which it's isomorphic, of which the structure of it matches the territory, is the degree to which your map will be accurate and functional.
And
right.
knowledge is structural, because it's the structure of your abstraction that we're dealing with. Like, it's the way the abstractions work with one another. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the maps, not the territory. But they can be isomorphic to different degrees, and so you can get better maps.
That's right. You can get better maps, and not you don't want to confuse your map with the territory. You don't want to forget that the knowledge, the structure of your map is actual reality, right? Mm-hmm. You always want to be in a sense of a little bit of, this is an abstraction, this is a map, right? You don't want to forget the two things.
This is the map that we're using in 1933 versus the map in 2018 versus the map in 2030. By keeping the time, the date of the abstraction in mind, it keeps us conscious that that is a map at a particular time. So we're less likely to confuse it with the allness of through time.
That's right. Yeah.
This is my map at this time. Because when we do that, it helps us maintain consciousness of the abstraction. And maintaining consciousness of the abstraction, maintaining consciousness that our knowledge is structural, how does that help us? Is that a question that, like, because what I'm hearing in this, again, I'm always looking for, okay, how do I use this to become more powerful, to create more beauty? Right? So when you say that some abstractions or some ways of holding abstractions, maintaining consciousness of abstractions, is better, it's more science, more sanity. Like, the main book is Science and Sanity.
That's right, yeah.
Right, which says that science is better and sane is better, and somehow science is more sane. This is what I get from the title. I don't know if this is accurate. Is that a fair abstraction?
I would qualify that as a fair abstraction, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Like, how does this help? Is that a fair question, or do you want to go anywhere else? I'm on the ride.
No, I'm with it. So I think, let me try to repeat your question. So basically, how does knowing that knowledge is structural, right? And how does, moving through levels of abstraction, through conscious levels of abstraction, how does that help me create more beauty, right?
How is it better? Like, it's better. You said that some are better than others. What do you mean better? How can you say better? Better according to whom?
Right. That some people would object to the word better because better doesn't exist.
Yeah,
right.
But you're saying that better does exist according to some standard. What's the standard? What does it mean for something to be better than something else?
Well, I mean, some maps are better than other maps, right? Some maps, and the way I would use better is that some maps, like, if I have, like, some maps actually help me get to go where I want to go, right? Because they're accurate, they're detailed, they're a structural match of the terrain in which I'm navigating. And so I'm starting off over here, and I want to go to point B, right, from A to B, and it tells me exactly how you take this path over here, you take a left, and then that'll get you to point B. But another map will take me to point C and call that point B, right? That's not actually where I want to go. So the map that takes me to where I want to go is actually, I would qualify that as better than the map that is full of inaccuracies that takes me to where I don't want to go, right? And so one big mistake that people make is they confuse the map and the territory neurologically, even if intellectually they know that they're not supposed to do that. In their nervous system, they'll hold onto their maps like it's the source of truth, like it's like reality.
They
And
they
they'll
lose consciousness of the abstraction and treat it as if it's truth and identity. Neurologically, they might consciously be able to describe that as an non-functional way of being, but when it comes down to it, they do it anyway.
That's right. They do it anyway, and they hold on to their maps as if it's they have identified with their maps, and so they become their maps, which make it very hard to change. Right? It makes it like very difficult. Like they've become so like they're holding on to it like it's like their life, and if anything changes to their map, then they're done for. Right? This is kind of like a Jordan Peterson kind of chaos order kind of thing that happens there, where due to trauma experiences that happen, Korzybski might call this a semantic disturbance in some way. It's like neurological
disturbance. Nice.
That's right.
Yeah, because it's semantics, orders of abstraction, and how we understand those, where we make our identities is semantics. And so a semantic disturbance would be the inability to adjust your map when you get new data from the territory.
That's right. Yes. Like so
I like that.
one
That's cool.
yeah. one I like that you like this. So an example. So let's say a mother raises a child and she's overprotective, and she doesn't let them know that there's any kind of malevolence that ever exists in this world. So the child now has this map, this viewpoint of like the world being like a very like a good and benevolent place. Then the child is thrown out into the world, meets malevolence, meets tragedy, meets something that their map was totally not prepared to meet. And so that he says that's the way in which people who go into wars have PTSD. Like a lot of that has happened because they started off with a naive map, a worldview, a picture, and once that actually meets reality, that's when like explosions happen. That's when the chaos, the great dragon of chaos comes in and just totally messes you up.
Since you brought up Jordan Peterson and this idea, so there's this Jordan Peterson metaphor, right, where you've got chaos and order. There's the known and the unknown, and consciousness, the hero, right, needs to build on order, use order as a basis in which to explore chaos, and then transform that chaos, discover the order in the chaos, make the unknown known. That's the heroic journey. If you go too far into chaos, then you disintegrate. If you go too far into order, then you reify and become tyrannical. And so you want to be on this border of order and chaos, right? Where you're using the holy word, the logos, in order to use your existing knowledge to expand. So that's one metaphor. And then I'm hearing this other metaphor from Korzybski, where you've got orders of abstraction, right? And if you lose consciousness of the abstraction, if you get caught in the scourge of identification, right, then you're too far on the side of order, right? Your internal neurology becomes tyrannical, right? And what happens is when you're given new information, instead of taking that new information and building it into your neurology, because you've lost consciousness of the identification, consciousness of abstraction, what happens is you fit this complex, multifaceted thing. It comes in and you have to force it into your ideological categories. And that does one of two things. One, it makes you more rigid in response to the thing. So you're not actually dealing with the thing. You're dealing with your category. And this is what he calls Peterson calls kind of the ideological trap. right? Where it's like, oh, I've got a univariate analysis. It's either X or Y. And then I get ABC and I say, okay, well, that's X. And I take all of the variation that's here and I reduce it down into one thing, right? Because I've lost consciousness of abstraction, right? I've got semantic disturbances. I've got semantic disturbances which have reified in my neurology. Even if I consciously know that I should be flexible in my thinking, even if I've consciously learned a postmodern way of thinking, I can get lost in a particular semantic disturbance, such as, I don't know, neo-Marxism, right? So now I've got this interesting thing where I've got a postmodern map, a postmodern set of abstractions that get reified, that get into a semantic disturbance that gets held, where I'm translating things from an ideological lens. I'm taking, like, I'm no longer conscious of the abstraction. And so when I get information that, if I were conscious of the abstraction, would be able to fit into a complex model, it gets oversimplified into an X or Y, even though it's A, B, and C. Right? And so I've got this semantic disturbance. And so the Petersonian metaphor or world or set of abstractions, when combined with the Korzybskian set of abstractions, right, explain one another. They triangulate into this higher level perspective. Oh, cool. Yeah, so that maps over, like, well, the way I mapped it over is clear to me. I don't know. Did what I say, does that match your experience? How would you expand it? How would you?
Yeah, no, I think you put a lot of really good words to that. Yeah, no, I see parallels between Korzybski and JP also. It's like, so when when X happens, now they have to like make sense of what's happening here. If their map is something that they're holding on to tightly, if it's really, like, if it's now the source of protecting themselves from chaos, like, you could see why that's kind of hard to let go of, because now whatever comes in that's different from their map represents some kind of chaos in some way, and so they're holding on to that with, like, a security, with like this map is now their security blanket, so to speak. And if their map is contradicted, if their map is, like, if there's a difference to their map, they're not agile enough now to let go of their map and to update their map and create a bigger picture. They're kind of stuck to what their frame, because they're holding that is, they're making a mistake in orders of abstraction. They're thinking that this thing is reality, this is truth, and
therefore, if I have some set of information that challenges this map that I think is reality, then it actually challenges my sense of reality. So from an epistemological perspective, it actually challenges the frame through which I'm understanding reality, which is destabilizing to my experience. But also, and this gets into the key is in the darkness, right? In the key is in the darkness, you could say the premise is that we create we end up with these semantic disturbances, these views of reality which are non-flexible to various degrees. And it's not only that we're interpreting the world through them, and so any threat to them actually destabilizes our world, right? Which is, bad enough, right? Physicists who were dealing with Newtonian reality, with a Newtonian idea, when they were that matter and time are actually different things, they get confronted with this, and they've got this idea, like, it's a Newtonian view of the world. This is the way that it is. And it allows us to do a bunch of things. And then Einstein comes along and says, no, actually space and time are they're two dimensions of the same thing, and that you can't understand one without the other, without having a really, really fundamentally problematic map when you encounter certain kinds of phenomenon. And they fought. It's like, no, not Einstein, that's bad, right? It's like they fought against it, because if they take that in, then they have to rethink everything, which requires an enormous amount of work. And now what's real and what's not real? How do I navigate the world if my map isn't good? Once I take apart my map, now how do I work with the world? Chaos. Like chaos comes in and disrupts order. That is bad enough. Right? But in The Keys in the Darkness, this idea is that it's not just that my ideas of reality, like my map for how to navigate reality, gets challenged. To the degree that I have built myself, my idea of who I am, into that map, to the degree that I think that I am that kind of person. I'm someone who stands for this. When data comes in which challenges my structures of abstraction, my structures of knowledge, if myself is built into those structures of knowledge, it's not just that my map for how to navigate the territory is undone, who I am is threatened. Right? I have identified myself with my understandings of knowledge and reality. And so I don't just protect this in order, like from a knowledge perspective. It's not just like, no, Newtonian physics is good. It allows us to do these things. If you do this, it's going to deconstruct
mess up my
Newtonian
map, and I'm going to have to rethink all this stuff. Yeah.
It's not just that I'm going to have to rethink it all. It's that means that I, myself, becomes not legitimate. I am wrong. I am bad. Who I think I am must be rethought. And again, this gets back into the Petersonian lens, which is, I think I'm going to be a doctor. I build my entire life on the fact that I'm going to be a doctor. And then I fail my medical exams and I'm no longer a doctor. It's not just, the plans I had went away. It's that all of the self, all of the emotions, all of the evaluative things of who I am and how I relate to other people and what's beautiful and what's my future, all of that disintegrates. So semantic disturbances can happen on multiple levels of abstraction in terms of my understanding of a context, my understanding of the mechanics of the context and how to work in it, but also who I am and where my value is and what it means to be me. All of that gets disturbed at this border of order and chaos, abstractions, orders of abstractions, and reality. And to the degree that I lose consciousness of abstraction, to the degree that I get caught in the scourge of identification, then my worldview and myself become reified. And now I become ideological. Anything that comes in threatens myself. And so it's not just that I argue against it, it's that I become self-righteous about it. Like I feel like myself is being attacked, not my ideas. I feel like the victim. And so in response to victimhood, I become self-righteous. And so I deal with this external information, the ABC that doesn't fit into my XY system, that threatens my XY binary, this multivariate thing that threatens my univariate analysis. I have to attack it and delegitimize its self.
Right. Yes. That's what people do.
And that's what people do.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hadn't thought of that dynamic through, like, I call this the victim self-righteousness dynamic, as you know, right? Yeah. So I like what the Korzybskian analysis brings to that.
Yeah. Yes, and it has me think of like two different directions, right? One is like in CTP, in creating thriving partnerships. There is this idea you bring up of people have their rule books, right? And Like I have my rule book and you have your rule book, and there's right way of thinking, but then there's the wrong way of thinking too, which a lot of people get stuck in, which creates negative feedback loops where I have the right rule book, and whatever you do, right, is if it's not against that's different than my rule book is wrong, right? That is a identification problem happening right there, where they identify, and it's similar, like they may identify themselves with the rule book, right? So anything that challenges their rule book challenges like their sense of self, which they will defend and fight against, which is kind of silly. Once you're in the right framework, it's like, oh, I have a rule book, and that's what I have, and you have your own rule book, and we can each have our own. Yours doesn't have to match mine, right? Because you having a different one isn't a threat to my existence in some way, right? So there's there's a little bit of that thing happening I see in there, and also in story making. And this is kind of like maybe like the next moving into that next chapter. Is I remember you saying one time that people think that their life, like they are characters in their story, right? And so and Korzybski doesn't really go into story and narrative, but my sense there's an identification problem happening in when people mistake their life stories with themselves, right? That's a thing that almost everyone does, is that they confuse the two. So, which creates, I'd say, a rigidity in their narrative capacities, right? Or in their character, right? They take their lives in a way too seriously, lose their sense of humor because they become so identified with their character, with their life. I think in thriving, that's a big problem. I think it's better to not do that, right?
Yes, in terms of what makes it better.
Yes.
What makes it better? When you recognize that our knowledge is structural, and you maintain consciousness of abstraction, then you avoid the scourge of identification, not only in your knowledge structures, your epistemology, but in your sense of values and who you think you are in relation to other people, and what's the overall becoming of which you are a part, right? And that it's better to have flexibility around that, to hold it lightly, such that you can take new information, that when you confront chaos, you can actually take that chaos through language, create new stories, and retell the story of order.
That's
such
right.
that it integrates the new information, rather than defending the order against the new information, rather than defending the self against, but by taking it so seriously.
Yeah. I mean, there's more than two ways of doing it, right?
Right.
One way has this effect, another way is that effect. There is no better though, because better doesn't exist, right? But
Yeah.
You get to choose.
Yeah, exactly. It's so again, to bring this down, to try to weave together some various metaphoric contexts or lenses or knowledge structures, different sets of orders of abstractions. The modern perspective, and I see that Korzybski is fundamentally moving past modernity. Modernity says that, okay, the world is the way that it is, and we can know it, and therefore we can build incredible structures. And we basically know how it is. And therefore, let's build on the structures that we have. Right? You can say this is the basic modern perspective. That's like, this is a pen. This is a pen. Let's build on the fact that it's a pen. Right? Postmodernism comes along and says, well, so you say it's a pen, and you built it to be a pen, but it's actually a weapon. And you're using it like a weapon, but you keep saying it's a pen. And so we're going to shift the focus from this being a pen to this being a weapon. And the modernists say, no, it's a pen. It's a pen. Like, you're denying its penness. That's fundamentally not real. And the postmodernist says, well, fuck you. It's a weapon. And the only reason you say it's a pen is because you've got penism. Right? You have pen privilege. Like, you're part of the culture that created this as a pen. And so, of course, you see it as a pen. That's the privileged position. You have power. You see it as a pen. And so in your narrative, more people agree with you. And so you say this is a pen. And if I say it's a weapon, you can delegitimize me through your power. You can say, well, I've got enough people who have the same structural knowledge as me, who have the same structure of knowledge. And therefore, I can delegitimize calling this a weapon. I can marginalize the perspective that says this is a weapon. Right? And that is problematic. Right? That creates problems because it is a weapon. Seeing it as a weapon is a completely legitimate way of seeing it.
That's right, yes.
Right? And from the Korzybskian perspective, it's like, no, to say that it's only a pen, to not be flexible and see it as a weapon.
Yes.
Right? That is a semantic disturbance. That's a reification. That is an identification, which is overly strict. It denies this other thing. And so you could say that Korzybski is fundamentally a move from the modern to the postmodern, where every way I can look at this, that I can describe it with any kind of fidelity, any kind of consistency through time, the fact that it's consistent through time creates its own legitimacy. And whether I choose to see this as a pen or whether I choose to see this as a weapon, right, that's just a choice. But if there are structures of power, right, which exist that say, no, pen is legitimate, weapon is not legitimate,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
then we need to shift the focus to the structures of power that make pen privileged and weapon marginalized. Right? This is the fundamental postmodern insight.
Yes.
I would say. Right? That we've got this recognition that yes, this can be a weapon. It's a legitimate way of saying it. Right? And you could say one of the challenges I have to Jordan Peterson is he recognizes, yes, you can see it as a weapon. Yes, structures of power are legitimate. Right? But if you take this structure of power, okay, this is a weapon, and now I make weapon into the identification, and I delegitimize pen.
Right. You're doing the same thing.
I'm doing the same thing. Right? And in this sense, the postmodern structures of oppression, social justice narrative has become its own tyranny.
That's right. Yes. Yep.
Right. And from a Korzybskian sense, that makes sense because it has become a fixed form of semantic disturbance, which, I don't know. So I question structures of knowledge to the degree that you lose consciousness of abstraction. Your structures of knowledge devolve into the scourge of identification.
The most likely.
Yeah.
Probably
So your story, your representation of how things are becomes fixed and inflexible and unable to take in the new information that you're getting. It's unable to update itself. It's not science as of 1933. It's science.
This is truth. This is reality.
This is truth. This is reality. So I can no longer, if there's something that disagrees with my model, I delegitimize it. Okay? that becomes fixed. Now the word that I've used many times is reify, to turn into a thing, to turn a process into a thing.
A nominalization.
A nominalization. In linguistic terms, in neurolinguistic terms, we nominalize it. We turn a process into a thing. And once it's a thing, to the degree that we forget that it's actually a process, to the degree that we lose consciousness of the abstraction, then it becomes an identity. And we become inflexible around it. We reify it. Okay, so question, when he says that knowledge is structural, I can imagine some structures are flexible and mutable and take in new informations and adapt and expand. Like they take this metaphor and they take them together and they create a higher level synthesis. And some structures are dogmatic and fixed. Does he have anything to say about that you know of?
Some structures are flexible, some structures are dynamic. Well, I think in some way that could be answered by looking at the structure of the structures in some way, like how well do the structures represent the territory, right? If you have a dogmatic, like unflexible structure, one would, like, I'd probably have to ask, is that an accurate representation of the actual territory if your structure is dogmatic? Because is that reality? Is reality unflexible? Is reality unchangeable the way that your structure is claiming it to be, right? Or is reality more of a thing that's constantly changing, growing, updating, like science, right? Is it a moving thing or is it a rigid thing, right? And so if someone has a rigid dogmatic structure, it might be a good, how accurate is their map, right, to that structure? How much have they identified? How much have they actually, do they actually believe that actually matches the territory, or are they actually identified with that structure in some way? And most likely they're probably identified with that structure in some way. They probably have their self invested, I guess, in it, which is what makes it dogmatic, which is what makes it, I think that's probably what makes it inflexible.
Right. And it sounds like dogmatism, inflexibility, identification, the scourge of identification, of thinking that a higher order abstraction is actually equal to a lower order abstraction, rather than a different order abstraction that involves multiple levels of deletion, distortion, and generalization. That to the degree that we get that identification, to the degree that it's fixed, inflexible, dogmatic, that's the opposite of science. Science is tentative, hypothetical, useful, flexible, open to new data, constantly updating. It's a dynamic process, not a fixed thing.
That's right. We could call, like, all of those ideas, what people call, like, have their, religious beliefs or postmodernism, we call them hypotheses. And they're kind of the same thing, but they change it in a different character. They're hypotheses versus whether they're the truth. Or is this an assumption or is it like a guess, right? And science would hold them all as hypothesis. They would hold them as this is my higher order of abstraction of how, like, universal laws, how I think this works, and I have evidence, and I'm basing off of this, and this. And I'm coming to, like, an example of, because I've seen it in Korzybski and I've seen it in Jordan Peterson talking about Euclid and Euclidean geometry, and how that was like that was a higher order hypothesis of how the world works, and it actually proved to be accurate for like thousands of years. Like, that's how you cannot find anything in this universe that disobeyed with Euclidean geometry for over 1,000 years until you did, right? And so are you going to maintain a rigid structure, like, in the face of new facts, right? Science updated, science changed. It didn't, and that's what makes science kind of amazing, is that's like the nature of science is to constantly update itself and to change, which is different than a lot of other things out there that don't have. Because one thing that Korzybski speaks about science is that it has a structure, a language, that allowed it to evolve, that allowed it to grow. Like it eliminated identification from its language structures, although the scientists themselves still have it in them. But they adopted a language similar to mathematics, right? In which was a very structurally similar. Mathematics is beautiful in that it's very structurally similar to the world or outside of us, which is why we can create amazing maps of it. But it eliminated identification from its language, which is why we are able to create such amazing technology because of that.
Because when we eliminate identification from our language, when we create a map which is both accurate and flexible, right? So you've got accuracy. Does your map accurately reflect the territory? From a pragmatic perspective, does using this map allow you to get to where you want to go? Right? Is this map fundamentally accurate or true? Right. So that's one dimension, and you can have accurate or inaccurate. And then you've got this other dimension, which is it rigid, inflexible, identification, like unable to expand with new information? Is it or is it flexible and adaptable and hypothetical and conscious of abstraction, such that it's always looking for how it can improve its map given new information, that's built into it, that it's looking for that in science, in the game of science, it's actually built into the methodology. That science is the updating of maps. It is designed to be ultimately flexible, but not flexible in any way, flexible towards accuracy.
Yes. It's like if you had a GPS, right? If you had a GPS today, and it would take you to where you want to go because it's accurate, it's up-to-date information, you'd say, oh, that's a good map, right? But if you take that and say this is the map that's going to be for all time, right? I'm never going to change this thing. 30 years from now, you're going to be in trouble. Maybe 5 years from now, you're going to be in trouble if you maintain rigidity to the GPS map that you currently have today.
Yes, and GPS might be a fully accurate map, but it doesn't take into account climate. You can have a climate map which is completely different than the GPS map. It's going to be related to it, but it's a different dimension. Or you can have a topographical map, right? Which it's just a different level of analysis than the GPS map. And being able to combine those maps, to be able to say, oh, there are multiple levels of maps, that's part of what science is about. That's right. Science is, we're always open to new levels of analysis that can improve our map. It might be that the GPS map is fundamentally accurate, like we end up using it for thousands of years or millions of years, assuming that human beings could last that long, right? Assuming that we could, we might, that GPS map from 2018 was sufficiently precise and sufficiently accurate that we still essentially use it today. Now, we've added in topography, we've added in climate, we've added in culture, we've added in any dimension you could. Our map is so much more complex. It's thousands of orders of magnitude more complex, but that GPS map is still fundamentally accurate, but we can expand. So in this quadrant, we've got accurate versus inaccurate, flexible versus inflexible. And so you can actually have accurate but inflexible maps. Right? And you can have flexible but inaccurate maps. Right? So it's interesting what I hear the postmodern critique of dominant culture of patriarchy, right? Of white male patriarchy, or that's kind of so white male privilege of patriarchy, is that its map might be accurate to a degree, but it is inflexible. It refuses to consider that the pen is a weapon. It refuses to consider the role of prejudice and structural oppression in its narrative. And that's the critique. The critique is, okay, the patriarchy is accurate to a degree, but inflexible. It's tyrannical in Jordan Peterson's thing. There's too much order and not enough flexibility. It's a semantic disturbance.
It thinks represents the whole of the truth,
It
right?
represents the whole of the truth when it doesn't. It's just a hypothetical, set of abstractions that we remain conscious of as abstractions.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
That's accurate and flexible. This is the ideal of science: accurate and flexible, getting more flexible, more accurate, more aware of its levels of abstraction, more conscious of abstraction, right? And more accurate, right? And Peterson is looking at the postmodern perspective, and he's saying, yes, this can be seen as a weapon, certainly, right? But that doesn't mean that it's only a weapon, right? In fact, if we look in the world, let's say, if we really look at it, it's probably about 95% pen. Like, the dominant thing that this is in the world in terms of actual impact is pen, right? That mostly our society is built on merit.
Which he'll base off of evidence, he'll base that information. He'll be grounded in scientific analysis that supports his viewpoint, right? He's not going to just make an assumption about it. That's what I love about Peterson.
And he's not delegitimizing alternate perspectives, except that he kind of sometimes does, and that's a problem. Like, he writes off the entire perspective because he has a legitimate critique of it, which is it's not all power. Right? To have a unit, to the degree that you take a postmodern perspective, you recognize that this is a pen, and it's a weapon, and it's orange, and it's cylinder, and it's plastic, and it's a doorstop, and. The postmodern perspective says each of those perspectives is legitimate. Right? Now, the postmodern perspective can also recognize blue. Wrong. It's orange. It is not blue. Right? We can look at it from multiple perspectives, but there is still right and wrong within each of those perspectives. As Ayn Rand would say, knowledge is contextual. Her postmodern insight is that knowledge is contextual, right? But if a postmodern perspective, and this is Jordan Peterson's critique of what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism, because he says, look, postmodernism says all of these perspectives have a degree of legitimacy. Absolutely. That's absolutely the case, right? But that doesn't mean that each one of them allows you to navigate the territory with equal grace or with equal power, right? In fact, there's very few interpretations that actually lead to real power, to lead to you actually being able to create a good life, to create a good society, to create things that last through time.
Yes.
Right? In this quadrant model, right? It's really only the top right section that's really what we want. It's science and sanity.
That's right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
The rest of it is increasingly bad. And the key is we want to get to increasingly good things that take into account the multiple perspectives, but also get us good results. And he says the postmodern neo-Marxists take the postmodern perspective, which allows them to decenter merit and patriarchy and logic and science and the existing knowledge systems, the existing structures of society as we know them. The postmodern part of it, they take postmodernism and decenter it. They say it's not the only interpretation. We're going to de-privilege you. We're going to ask you to check your privilege. You think that your perspective is the right perspective. And we're going to say that that's a position of privilege. That from your position of privilege, you don't even have to think about the fact that it's a weapon. You can just declare it to be legitimate. And that's a position of privilege. And we want you to check your privilege. We want you to question that the pen is the only way to see this thing. We want you to give the idea that it's a weapon legitimacy. And that's postmodernism. And that is, I think, completely a legitimate analysis. It's valuable. If you don't do that, it's because you've got a semantic disturbance and you're not doing science and you're not looking at the philosophy, like you're not like dealing with the thing. You're making your own univariate analysis in which you delegitimize the variables that you're not looking at.
Well, you have a worldview that doesn't include that, right?
Yes,
and you say
yes.
that's
and you're identified with that worldview, both in terms of it is an identification, it is reified, it is a non-flexible structure, it is dogmatic. And most likely you've identified yourself with that structure, and therefore you experience attacks on that structure as attacks on yourself, so you feel like a victim and become self-righteous and attack. That's right. Okay, so there's that. But then Jordan Peterson says, however, if we're going to consider all of the perspectives, we then need to look at, okay, which perspectives are useful in creating real results? Right? So some are better, but we need to consider them in order to figure out which one is better. And we can't just privilege one of them. I agree with you in your postmodern perspective. You can't just say one of these is right. That would be a univariate analysis. That would be to become dogmatic, to identify. And he says, so now you've got not only postmodernism, but neo-Marxism. So people in the social justice milieu, as he describes it, right, they take on postmodernism, which allows them to deprivilege existing culture. Legitimately, to say it is not the only way of being, it is not the only perspective. There are, in fact, multiple perspectives. This is not only a pen, it is a weapon. But then they say it's only a weapon. The only thing that matters about this is that it's a weapon, and they turn it into a new semantic disturbance, a new thing.
That's right.
So you can't, like he says, you can't have postmodernism and neo-Marxism. It's one or the other. Right? Because if you take postmodernism seriously, then you can't privilege the Marxist perspective. You can't privilege the structural oppression narrative. That would be rigid. That would be tyrannical.
They would be kind of replacing one tyrannical source with another tyrannical source.
Yes. Yes. And so if I have a critique of Jordan Peterson, this is one of my critiques of Jordan Peterson, is that he associates postmodern neo-Marxism with chaos. And I don't think it's chaos, it's tyranny.
Yeah. I think it depends on what viewpoint you're looking from, right? Does it? Like, so from the perspective of from one perspective, it looks like chaos when it comes from, if from the perspective of the person holding on to, like, this is a pen, right? That their perspective looks like chaos would occur as chaos because it's bringing chaos to their structure right over here, right? Mm-hmm. So on one level, it would be chaos, but from the level of the postmodernism structure, they have a tyrannical structure happening too. So it kind of seems like a both and. It depends on what level of analysis you're looking at. Like, if Jordan Peterson is saying that's chaos, then he's, in some way, he's coming from
identifying with the existing structure.
He may be identifying with the existing structure. Yes.
And to the degree that he has identified with the existing structure, he'll become victimized and self-righteous. Right. Now, I actually don't think that's necessarily what's happening.
Yeah.
I think that, again, okay, this is fantastic. So we're bringing in more levels to this. This is really useful to me. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm loving it too. Yeah.
So one way of interpreting Jordan Peterson using the model that we've got so far, right, is that he recognizes postmodernism. He recognizes that this is both a pen and a weapon, that's a fine way of looking at it, but also orange, but also cylinder, but also doorstop, but also like also. And if you're going to recognize multiple things, how do you privilege one of them? Right? You could say this is his analysis of the wage gap. Right? If you're going to say that it's like or intersectionality, right? You're white and you're a woman but you're tall and you're intelligent and you're attractive and you're thin. Like there's like all of these different levels where you can like analyze this. Which one do you make predominant? So he says from the perspective of the existing order, postmodernism is chaos, or this postmodern neo-Marxist social justice perspective is chaos. Right? One way of looking at it. And so because he's identified with the existing order, he experiences that as an attack. He experiences himself and other people as the victim of that attack. And so he becomes self-righteous in his criticism.
That would happen, yeah. Right. To the degree in which he experiences himself as a victim.
Great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Or he experiences others as victims. Lindsay Shepard, James Damore, his clients who have been like, who started this off because his clients were being kind of attacked by the social justice perspective, and he felt them to be victimized. And so he went, I must fight this. I am not going to allow this to happen. I will, like he says, I will not obey your laws. And if you find me, I won't pay the fine. And if you throw me to jail, I won't eat. I will do a hunger strike. I am not going to play this game. Right? So
which is on its face isn't necessarily victimization. Like, right?
So
could be a boundary.
It's a boundary. And I would say that Jordan Peterson is self-righteous, right? The self-righteousness, he expresses himself self-righteously to a degree. Not always. But like, it's like me. You can tell when I'm like getting in that, because my voice goes up in here and I'm like, hey, right? So there's like this self-righteous kind of tone, but it's not just self-righteousness. And this is the thing. It's like, what is the order in this analysis? Let's say this is an accurate analysis, hypothetically.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Maintaining consciousness of the abstraction. That's right. Right? That's right. So now let's look at what is the order that Jordan Peterson is like protecting. What is the order that he's identifying with such that he experiences the social justice warriors as chaos? Right? And there's two fundamental ways of looking at it. I mean, there's an infinite number of ways of looking at it, but I'm going to choose two which I think are fundamental. Maintaining consciousness of the abstraction. Right? One is, it's the existing patriarchal system in which he has power. Right? That's the system that he's protecting. The system that gives males privilege. The system in which he gets to speak his voice and delegitimize others, which is arbitrary and based on power. That's the system that he's identified with, and that's the system that he considers, from which he considers social justice warriors to be chaos.
A lot of people have that viewpoint too.
Yes.
Yes, a number of people.
Yes. Or, as an alternative perspective, what is the order? What is the viewpoint? What is the system that he is protecting, that he feels is being threatened? Is the idea of knowledge and the idea of the individual and the idea of the possibility of merit and the idea of Western civilization, which he states is not patriarchy. It is science. It is the recognition of the individual, which has built our entire society and which is beautiful, which is, in Ayn Rand's perspective, the American Revolution was the revolution that said the individual is more important than the state. right? That the individual is that we have individual rights which cannot be violated, and no one is above the law, right? It's a common thing. Everyone is subject to the law, and everyone has equal rights before the law. I mean, as long as you're a person. At that time, we had this little thing called slavery, which was problematic.
Yeah.
Kind of.
A little bit.
But the idea is, and that idea has come to fruition over time, that we are all equal before the law, that the individual is the level of analysis. Now, if Jordan Peterson is identified with that, if that's the idea that he's protecting, then yes, social justice warriors are an experience of chaos, but he's not protecting the existing social order of patriarchy, right? The New York Times piece called him the custodian of the patriarchy, right? They're saying what he's protecting is white male dominance, white male cis dominance. That's what he's protecting. And he's like, no, what I'm protecting is the idea of individuals.
That's
the
right.
ideas of rationality, the ideas of rational discourse and science. That's what I'm protecting. And therefore, this postmodernism isn't bad. Neo-Marxism is a univariate analysis. And that's problematic. That's fundamentally problematic. As Korzybski would say, that's a semantic disturbance, which is problematic because it makes the system inflexible to new information. It's not science. It's not self-critical in that sense, right? And so the question is, how do you understand Peterson? Is he custodian of the patriarchy? Or is he a champion of the individual soul? And a society in which each individual soul is respected for who they are as a person, as a soul, right? As Martin Luther King would say, judged by the content of their character rather than by their genitalia or their skin color or their sexual orientation, right? What is the chaos against which he's defending, against which order? Anyway, using the language that we've built in this conversation, it allows me to make that distinction, which is a fantastic distinction. I think that's the true criticism of Peterson, is that he's not, and you could say the best questioners, the best interviewers have said, okay, great, so you're protecting the individual, but what about the parts of society that suck? And he says, okay, sucks compared to what? Sucks compared to 100 years ago? Sucks compared to all of human history? Sucks compared to 30 years ago? Or sucks compared to your utopia? Right? Completely legitimate response. That is a fundamental question. Against what are you comparing? Like, by what criteria do you choose your criteria? What is the frame of reference that you're using to say that it sucks? Because if you compare what we've got now compared to all of human history, it's the best time ever to be alive, especially in the Western patriarchies. Right? Not necessarily the there are some cultures which are patriarchies in the classic sense, where women are not offered equal rights before the law. But in the Western systems, they are offered equal rights before the law. And that's pretty friggin' cool. Compared to all of human history, that is epic. It doesn't suck. It is epic. It is amazing.
Compared to all of human history, compared to other places in the world today,
yes.
Like Syria, Iran. Like, I guess his argument in some places, like, dude, if you want to see a patriarchy, go live in Iran for 5 years. That's a patriarchy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And that is a legitimate way of dealing with the criticism that he doesn't sufficiently critique our modern society. That his focus is almost solely on the people who are trying to tear down society and how to protect the individual and how to protect meritocracy and protect science and protect discourse and free speech. But he's not criticizing the existing systems very much. All he says is, of course it's unfair, but hierarchy is 250 million years old, right? So you can't, right? You can't lay that at the foot of capitalism. That's the wrong analysis. Yes, that's true. It is the wrong analysis. However, how about spending some time on what's messed up about our society? You're not doing that, Jordan. And that is convenient for the people in power. It's convenient for the people in power that you are only criticizing the people who are challenging the people in power. Right? Yes, you're saying that what you're protecting is individual rights, that the order that you're protecting, the knowledge that you're protecting, the orders of abstraction, the structural knowledge that you're protecting is individual rights, the idea of the individual, the sociological primacy of the individual, the political primacy of the individual, science, discourse, knowledge. Those are things you're protecting. But that looks a lot like the patriarchy. And unless you differentiate yourself from the patriarchy, we're going to call you the custodian of the patriarchy. Now, that's completely disingenuous, and anyone who listens to you knows that that's not true. But you should really make that point clearly.
Right. So, yeah. I think that sounds like a fair criticism of Peterson, because he does. I see him on Fox News a lot. You know, I see him like go on these shows, and it seems like he's targeted his protection, you know, on the radical left. Like he really has focused on the radical left, and I've heard him mention that he does that because he's in academia, right? And that's where he sees the main onslaught coming from in the humanities department, is coming from that viewpoint, right? And I think there's a lot of identification that's happening in the right too, right? And on the left. Like, I don't know which, like, I see him target one side way more than the other side. And I don't know, that would be my critique of him, is that I don't know that he's, like, he seems focused on one area, but I don't know if that's, like, the main area that's going to lead us to, like, destruction, right?
Okay, great. I think that is a legitimate critique. I think that's an important critique. I think that the terms that we've laid out today, that we kind of co-created, this space that we've created, this vocabulary space, this set of structural knowledge, this set of hypotheses or interprojective narrative frames through which we can interpret the world, the things that we've created today, helps us understand that criticism with the level of nuance and depth that I think is really important. Let me defend Peterson. Given what we just said, let me defend him. I'm sorry if I'm stealing your thunder if you were about to do this, but I'm a greedy bastard and selfish and all of those things. So, in a Piagetian game, right, in this game that he talks about where it's like, okay, if you have a single interaction with a person, you can completely dominate them. And you win the game. Yay! Except if the person doesn't want to play with you in the future, then you've lost the set of all games with that person. Right? Because there's actually, you're not just playing one game, you're playing a set of games across time. And if you don't play in a way that people want to play with you, with any one particular person, you lose all of the wins that you could get from all of the games that you could play with that person. Right? This is why in creating thriving partnerships, I say that you have to honor your I integrity first and foremost, but you must honor the you integrity next and necessary in order to create an us integrity of agreements that actually serves as a game. You have a relationship, a game, and that game must honor the you and the I, or it's going to disintegrate over time. So it's not enough just to honor yourself. You must honor the other person. You must attempt to understand what they think, feel, and want. And you must attempt to only create rules that are good for them. so that they'll want to keep playing with you over time, and you can maximize the results from that set of games, not just from the game that you're playing right now. Not just what can I get now, but what can I get now in a way that's a win for the other person. It must be win-win in order for thriving, in order to maximize what you get from all the games, right? This is the thriving partnerships perspective. But in the Piagetian recognition, winning this game but losing the whole set of games is a bad move. Similarly, you want to be able to play a game not just with one person, but with multiple people. Right? That if you play a game that you can only play with one person, but you lose all of the other potential games, again, you're losing relative, like you're winning, like you won the first game, you won, great. But you lost all of the possibility. Okay, you won with this person, but you lost all the possibility of all the other people.
It's like a sociopath, right, who plays a game and like a cheater, right, or who breaks rules. He's got to leave.
And this is where it comes in, right?
Yeah.
You've got one person over time, you've got all people over time, and you've got the group of games of all people over time, right? You keep expanding in terms of the number of people that you're including in your game theory and the amount of time you include in your game theory. And then what becomes a good move shifts relative to that context. Right? Again, Rand says knowledge is contextual. So once you think about it from that perspective, you might lose in a particular game because the structures of that game are not perfectly fair. Right? You get into a game and someone has a structural advantage. Right? And so you could say that game is not legitimate. How do you do that? If you go in and say, therefore, the entire structures of the game need to be torn down, now you might have solved the problem for that particular game, of that particular structural inequity, that particular structural advantage. But you've undermined the very context of the games. And it's that context of the games that allows you to play through time across people. And the fundamental game of Western civilization in which we play all of our games is individual rights, equality before the law. Everyone plays by the same rules, right? And we accept that there's a certain amount of inequity. Some people are more attractive than others, and that fundamentally changes the rules of the game for them. Some people are taller than others, and that gives them a particular advantage in certain kinds of contexts. Some people were born with more money. Some people were born with certain kinds of genetic dispositions or temperaments, and those are better suited to different parts of the game, right? And if you want to devalue the game and take apart the structures of the game in order to deal with an inequity, that is the real problem. That's the real problem. Not that a group of people gain power in Italy, right? Not that you get a populist enemy. Not that you get a wild card fake Republican president in Trump who breaks most of the norms of what we've been used to for presidential politics, right? That's a problem because he's undermining the game. He's not the only one undermining the game, of course, right? Like the political polarization is destabilizing the whole game, and as Jordan Peterson would say, that's the problem. The problem is the destabilization of the game. The problem is the people who are trying to take apart the fundamental rules that underlie all the games. And that's what the radical left is doing. It's challenging the underlying logic of all of the Piagetian games. Like, it is the greater threat to the fundamental order. Because if you just keep the rules of the game in place, over time, they will self-correct towards more and more fairness, which is what we see. Like, you could say the United States put in this idea of individual rights. And as that idea, that fundamental idea, got put into the culture, it starts eroding every other distinction, right? Racism, like in the face of that, became more virulent because now you had to have them not be people. They can't be individuals because that means that we can't have slavery and individual rights. But individual rights was the deeper game. It was the better Piagetian game.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
I'm with.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah. Okay, so I've said
I'm with
enough.
you.
Your turn.
You know, I'm totally with you on that. That makes sense to me, and I'm glad you brought that point of view because it's responding to, oh, why focus on the left rather than the right? And you're saying that the reason why you're focusing on the left is because they're challenging the very fundamental nature of the game, right? And that's actually a bigger threat right now because that's long term. That's kind of a big deal.
And we watched that happen in the 20th century over and over and over. The Nazis underwrote the game. They changed the nature of the game, and they made it so that individual rights were not preeminent. And that gave them permission to do horrible things. And the communists, the socialists in Russia, took away individual rights. They made equity more important. And that led to the deaths of what, 50 million people, 30 million people, 70 million people? We're not quite sure. Somewhere in that range. That's not good. Right? In China, Mao did the same thing. And that led to the deaths of 50 million people, 100 million people. We're not sure. And these aren't deaths in war. These are deaths of civilian at the hands of the government through starvation or imprisonment and execution. There's Pol Pot. There's what's happening in Venezuela right now. Right? Where you're taking one of the richest countries in South America and it is now the poorest country in South America. And it's just diving down worse and worse and worse. Like, that's the real problem. Right? And the more you do that, the more you create room for Trumps, the more you create room for totalitarian governments. Because in the face of that, the totalitarians can rise to power because who can stop them? How can you stop them? You've given away the one tool you can use to stop them, which is the respect for individual rights. So yeah. It's like that the left is undermining the structures of the game. And we've seen that happen, and it is horrific. Let's not do that again. That's the real danger, not a few racists.
Yeah. So I could see like Jordan Peterson speaks to that very well, and that's in the game he's playing in some ways, like saying no to that happening. Right? The reason why he's coming out against he came out against transgender, that whole they them pronouns. The whole pronoun thing was not because he's transphobic, as a lot of people say, but it's because the underpinnings of that neo-Marxism ideology is implicit within that law that was put in that. So that's what he's coming out against. That's what he's saying no to, and a lot of people are like, fuck yeah, thanks for saying no to that. I want to go back to your critique of Jordan Peterson for a second, because I'm like, okay, so if that's the case, so that's the chaos that he's seeing in, right? And you say you see some self-righteousness or something happening that he's defending. I'm wondering, how do you differentiate between like the game he's playing and saying no to that, right? Versus like, how do you know, is he saying no to that, or is he like, is he also saying like, is he like defending like a structure, right? Like, I guess that's the question that I hold is how are you able to differentiate the difference, and what would you have him like if your critique of him is that he's maintaining a patriarchal order, or that it could appear that he's maintaining some kind of patriarchal, he's not going after, he's like, what would you have how would you have him respond differently than how he's responding now? Because he seems like he's responding very forcefully to the threat that you just put,
Right.
that you
So there's a guy out there named Fuller who created this company called Rebel Wisdom. He's done a couple documentaries on Jordan Peterson, and he's essentially building his business around Jordan Peterson, which is a brilliant business move. I applaud him for that. He does personal development work, and he's using Peterson as a platform to gain notoriety, and for good reason. I'm not necessarily questioning his motivations, although I am to a degree, and I think he's doing brilliant work, and I think that he's using Peterson inappropriately, and I'm very upset with him right now. But one of his critiques, which is I think a very legitimate critique, is that when Jordan Peterson gets upset and he gets passionate, he can be somewhat dismissive of his opponents, and he can paint them in a very ugly light. He questions their character, which is not necessarily wrong, but if you're going to question someone's character, you have to do it with some level of circumspection. Like, you have to be like, okay, I'm going to question this person's character. That's a heavy-duty thing to do, so I'm going to do it with a certain amount of precision and clarity, compassion, and equanimity in my voice tone. Like, I want to take this seriously. And Jordan Peterson sometimes slips into, can you believe that these
Okay. I've seen him do that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so the criticism of him, and I think this is a legitimate criticism, although I think Fuller's explanation for why it happens is completely out of bounds and inappropriate, and I want to take him to task for it. But the criticism is that creates problems. That when you take on that voice tone, right, you create a backlash. Right? In my work, I'm in the victim self-righteousness dynamic, that when you go into right wrong, because he's going into right wrong, he's not saying they have legitimate points, right? He says that at times, but then he slips into, and they're wrong, I'm right, they're wrong, they're so wrong that I get to take on this voice tone, right? And I call that self-righteousness. Like,
he was called an angry white man on stage one time because right after he took that, yeah.
Yes. And while that is a legitimate criticism, that again ignored the fact that it was a pen. Like, 5% accurate, 95% missing the friggin' point, right? Because he was making good points. Okay, right? When you've studied the Holocaust, when you've studied the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the name of equity and Marxism, and you've seen the depravities to which human beings can go when they lose touch with the value of the individual person, when they put the person's group above their individual identity. He spent his life studying this, and he's seen the horrors of it. Like, part of it is self-righteousness, and part of it is just, look, this is horrible. This is, no, you've got to look at the sheer evil of this, right? So I understand his presentation to be partly just appropriate intensity and passion given the horrors involved. And he slips into some self-righteousness where it's not just, I am being clear and I am being passionate because of the horrors of what's going on, which is legitimate and appropriate. It's that he is self-righteous. And that comes out in the voice tones that he uses. And in my work, I say that whenever someone comes at someone self-righteously, even if what they're saying is 95% true, they will react to the self-righteousness rather than the truth. They will get triggered, and that trigger will use so much of their neurology, so much of their mental bandwidth, that they will be less able to deal with the actual argument because they'll be more dealing with the fact that they're being shamed.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Which is a semantic disturbance, by the way.
Which is a semantic disturbance, yes, that we all have, that I say is genetically inbuilt, and so we should work around that. We should certainly resolve our semantic disturbances. The more we resolve our shame, the more capacity we have to actually deal with reality as it is. We have more bandwidth available to actually solve our problems, right? To update our maps so that they're more accurate and flexible. The more we deal with our shame, the better. Yes, yes, yes. It is a semantic disturbance, and everybody's got it. So because of that, when Jordan Peterson slips into self-righteousness, he creates an opposition that is unnecessary.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
So that is the criticism. Now, I'll say one more thing, and then So let's say that that's an accurate critique. I think it is an accurate critique. I think it's a valid critique. I think Jordan Peterson can learn from that. I think everyone can learn from it. Right? I think I could learn from it. And the question is, of the people who criticize Jordan Peterson, right? You've got this set of people who criticize Jordan Peterson. A certain percentage of those would not criticize him if he did not bring a self-righteous tone. There's a certain set of people who criticize Jordan Peterson mostly because of his tone, not because of his argument.
They don't even listen to his argument because of his tone.
Correct. And the question is, what percentage of the people who criticize Jordan Peterson criticize him because of his tone, and what percentage of them criticize him because it threatens their semantic disturbance, right? And they experience him as chaotic and threatening their power and threatening their identity, and so they feel personally threatened. Like, what percentage? And I think it's actually like 5%. I think only about 5% of the people who are criticizing Peterson do it because of his tone. That 95% of the people who criticize Jordan Peterson would criticize him just as much, even if he had a perfect tone. And unless you make that distinction, unless you say, like, okay, like, what's the percentage? What's the edge case where his tone makes the difference? Unless you focus on what that percentage is, your criticism is fundamentally misplaced. And that's why I want to take Fuller to task. Because he is, to put it in the most hostile terms, he is abetting the enemy. Jordan Peterson is trying to protect the fundamentals of the game of Western civilization. Like, that is the big game. That's the game he's playing, and he's doing it with power and grace and unbelievable effectiveness in terms of rising to prominence. Having an argument rise to prominence in a culture never happened before like this. I don't think there is an example of anyone doing what Peterson has done. It is an epic achievement. And if you're going to criticize that, you have to be really careful and circumspect. And I'm pissed off at Fuller because I don't think he has been fair to Jordan Peterson. It is true that his tone creates problems. That's a legitimate criticism. The rest of what Fuller says, I am not happy with, because like, I am on the side of Western civilization. I am on the side of respecting the individual soul and treating them as inspired by Martin Luther King. Not that it's the truth, but according to their character, not their sex, not their gender, not their sexual orientation, none of that. According to their character. And that's what Jordan Peterson is about. Okay, I've done my piece. Thank you for giving me a little extra time.
I wanted to make one just point about that. So the thing that I got when I first saw it, what got me interested in Jordan Peterson was his interview with Kathy Newman. And that was a video where she came at him in multiple different angles, like accusing him, like totally misinterpreting what he was saying. And it was the way that he responded to that without not going into like a victimized mentality, but like there's a way he responded to her and even came back at her with a question, right? That had me really engaged with Jordan Peterson. So it was that interview over there where I'm like, okay, that he showed up amazing. Because he showed up amazing in a way that I got, oh man, who the fuck is this guy? Like he's like how he handled himself in that interview, not like defending himself against her charges, but actually like saying what he believed and also coming back at her with a question or two here and there. So I wonder if you took, and after what you said, if you took that video, it's like how much of that criticism after that video, like, because I didn't see a lot of victim self-righteousness and bad tones in that video. I thought he handled himself very well in that video, which I think is why it became so popular in some way, because he handled himself differently than a lot of other people would have. How much of the criticism after that video is on the content, right? And how many of those, like, right? Like how much, I guess, yeah, I don't know, but like how much, yeah.
So to compliment you on finding an extraordinary example of the edge case so that we can examine. So what is the percentage? Mark, you're saying it's 95%, 5%. Is that accurate? We could actually use this as a test case in order to get some growth on that, right? You were impressed by exactly that issue. The fact that he didn't become self-righteous had an extraordinary impact on you and had you study him. Okay, now, I will say that video shot him into prominence in a way that eclipsed anything that had happened before. And so a lot of people, because of what he did, he was brought into prominence. I suggest that is why the New York Times did the hit piece on him. That's why Channel 4 did the hit piece on him. That's why people are coming out in droves to critique him. Because he showed up so cleanly. So there's the proximate response to that video, which is how many of the comments on that video were about his tone, and how many of them were pro-Peterson, how many of them were anti-Peterson, how many of them dealt with his tone, how many of them dealt with his argument, right? And what I'll say is the proximate result of that was that most of the chatter, most of the responses to that video were positive to Peterson because of his tone. And that led to a spreading of his ideas, which was epic. But the more distal, reactive mode of that is that because he was calm and because his ideas spread more people came out against him because of his ideas. Right? That the criticisms of Jordan Peterson are not about his tone, except from his allies. It's only his allies that go against his tone, and Michael Eric Dyson.
Right. And I think it posed like an opportunity for Jordan Peterson, because it's like in his tone, you see in from that Kathy Newman example how powerful that video was based on his tone, right? So they're pointing out a really important factor. Hey, Jordan, if you fix this up, right? If you can lose the angry white guy tone, right, and come more from a place where you did in that Kathy Newman video, like that, being able to speak those ideas with a tone that's not self-righteous,
would be better.
Would be better.
That is, I think, an inarguable point, and it is a great point, and it is probably the best criticism of Jordan Peterson as a presenter. Mm-hmm. As the vehicle for a message, I think that is the best argument against Jordan Peterson. Doesn't deal with his message at all. Right? And it's a legitimate critique. It is, in fact, I think, one of the best critiques you can offer him, and I hope that he takes it to heart, because the ideas that he's arguing for are fundamentally important and good, and I am, in that sense, a Jordan Peterson fanboy. I'm 95% on board with him. I think he gives. I don't think he gives enough airtime, enough value to the fact that this is a weapon. I don't think he gives enough airtime to the grievances of structural oppression. Right? I think that if he were to deal with that project head on, he would be able to both say what's right about it and show that 95% of it is off. Right? This is in that interjection in that conversation with Michael Eric Dyson. He says, okay, so which part of my white privilege accounts for my success? What percentage? Right? To which Michael Eric Dyson responded, homie, don't play that. Like, white privilege doesn't happen empirically. It's not about your results. It's about the culture's willingness to have the conversation, which is true. But if everyone who was in the social justice movement understood that, right, that if you're successful, it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, 30% of your success is attributable to your white privilege. Well, first of all, if we were to put a number on it, if we were to insist that we look at it through that perspective, it would be a very small percentage. In the same way that when you look at the wage gap between men and women, and you look at all of the multivariate analysis, the portion that can be attributed to discrimination is either non-existent or in the 1 to 2, 3% range. That's a problem. That's a problem. Should be addressed. Right? Sexual harassment in the workplace is a problem. Should be addressed. But is it 50% of the issue? Is it 100% of the issue? No. If we really get empirical about it, it gets down into the 1, 2, 3% range. And it is on the left, Michael Eric Dyson, it is in his advantage to avoid the question altogether, to say that that question is not legitimate. The question of what percent of my success is due to my white male privilege, that is an illegitimate question. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. That's how they deal with that question. And if they didn't do it with that way, if they said, okay, great, well, so let's look at that. Let's say that it's 2%. Let's say that it's 5%. We're going to admit that it's only 5%. Maybe it's 10% in some circumstances. Right? Because once you start saying, well, you were born into wealth. Yeah, you were born with reasonable intelligence. You weren't born developmentally disabled. Okay, that's my privilege? Is that really where we want to go? Right? That I shouldn't have more because I worked harder, because I was brought up in a family where they taught me good work ethic? Versus somebody who wasn't taught good work ethic? Therefore I shouldn't have more? Like, is that really where we want to, like, if they really clarified the issues rather than just saying that entire conversation is illegitimate, we don't deal with that conversation, which is what Michael Eric Dyson said in response. He says it doesn't play out empirically. We don't address that. That's not the game that white privilege is playing.
And to ask it empirically is probably just a symptom of your white privilege.
Yes, of course you would want to make it into an empirical question of percentage, because then you could justify yourself without having to address the issue.
That's right, yeah.
Right, and that's true. Mm-hmm. It's true. Mm-hmm. If you can justify yourself, if you can say, look, it's 2%, let's not focus on that. It's a way of marginalizing the issue. That's all true. But if people actually knew that, they would lose almost all of their support. That's the issue. Anyway. Okay, so I would like, for purposes of time, to close this conversation and continue it at a later time.
Yes. Sounds great. I would love to continue this conversation. Yeah.
Sweet.